But I've since used it to do things like start my car when the battery was dead.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a huge thread in the PGM study and practice group about people fixing their air conditioning or their printer or things like that. And it's funny because some of my peers have really made this into something for ridicule, that I would be using this magic for things that are beneath their, you know, because they see it as being like religious magic, and this is beneath you to be using it for this, and I'm like, it works, and I'm here for it to work, and also as far as religious studies go, I feel like if you can give people something that works, they're gonna maybe some of them want to look behind the curtain and say, "Wow, this is real, and I want to connect with these spirits that are making this happen."
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead.
So thank you for joining me today. It is wonderful to be welcoming our guest today, Alison Chicosky, who is a phenomenal scholar of thaumaturgy, of PGM magic, and pentacle creation, and a number of other really practical and excellent forms of magic. She is the author of the recently released Secrets of Helios, Unlocking the Practical Uses of PGM for 1596 through 1715, published by Hadean Press. She has a background in Solomonic magic as well as Greco-Egyptian magic. She is the purveyor of the Practical Occult website. She also has written extensively online about her practices with PGM and is an admin for a couple of excellent Facebook groups, one on PGM that I'm a member of and highly recommend for its excellent discussions. I've been really looking forward to having Alison on the show, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it is wonderful to have you join us. And while we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time, I like to start these interviews by asking if you could just kind of give us a little bit of background about your entryways into magic, and particularly because of the focus of this podcast, if there are any interesting things about divination that you may have encountered earlier in life, or if not, what your first forays into divination itself were.
Well, my magical history has been kind of convoluted. I didn't just fall into the Greek Magical Papyri. It's kind of a little subsection there. So I was always kind of spooky. So I grew up reading about paranormal things and seeing things, and having odd experiences that I couldn't really characterize, and that adults were, telling me weren't happening, and things like that. So that kind of catapulted me into researching the occult, and then magic, because when you're like a sensitive child and you've got spirits that are attracted to you, there's really not much to do about that if they're bothering you. So that's when you've got to turn to magic, because magic definitely has ways to keep spirits from bothering you. So that's one of the reasons why I started looking into that years ago. And then regarding divination, I don't do any professionally, but divination is available professionally through the Practical Occult site, through my partner Alexander Moore there. For me, I do really a lot of different things. I read runes. I've read tarot. I've got a little Norman deck. So I feel like when you're when you've got kind of a skill with divination, you can really almost do it with anything. So sometimes small things will be meaningful to me. Like there'll be times where I just randomly look out the window and there's a spider spinning a web in the corner, but in that instant, it's very, very meaningful to something in my life. So I feel that regarding divination, it's a way to tap into things that you already know, and messages that you're already receiving from the universe, and kind of clarify that. And there's definitely plenty of divination in the Greek Magical Papyri, though not the sort of divination necessarily that we think of when we think of divination. So I know when a lot of modern people hear divination, we think of cartomancy. But the Greek Magical Papyri has everything from water bowl divination, hygromancy, to the conjuration of the spirits of the dead to give information. So, there's that. There's also calling on spirits to send dreams that will help you interpret something. So there's 2 spells in the PGM where you say an invocation, and then if the answer is no, you'll dream about fire and iron. And if the answer is yes, you'll dream about plants and water. So one of my friends tested this at one point, and he did the invocation, and then that night he dreamed about scuba diving. So that was interpreted
very
as
clear. Yes. Yeah.
Question.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's excellent, and I'm excited to talk to you about that. Of course, there's so much to talk about with the PGM. It is such a fascinating topic. I'm fascinated with it myself personally, and I wanted to, just for people who are tuning in and who may not really, we're throwing these 3 letters out a lot, PGM, and we haven't really defined what we're talking about. And you are excellent at breaking down very basically what that is. Could you just quickly explain for people what this is that we're talking about?
Sure. So the PGM is a collection of papyri, and PGM stands for Greek Magical Papyri. And this collection of papyri is from the Greco-Roman imperial era of Egypt. So it's Egyptian magic. That was probably, a lot of it was being done by lector priests of the period. So people that were doing work for their congregation. So you've got all of these texts, and it spans like a 400-year period, and all of them are written in Greek because in the imperial era of Egypt, the Greeks had moved in and been like, oh, we're here now. Everybody's got to write things in Greek. This is how we're keeping our records. So everyone was keeping records in Greek at the time. And, at some point, scholars just sectioned out all of the papyri that were written in Greek that had to do with what they considered to be magic. And magic would be Heka for personal use. For the Egyptians, Heka is the harnessing of the power of the universe, the power that created the universe and daily moves it. So it's harnessing that, and then asking for stuff for yourself, as opposed to temple magic. So
yeah, and thank you for explaining that so clearly. I think that talking about Heka and talking about like the Egyptian view of magic is fascinating, and also kind of helpful as a way in for what the style of this magic is. I would love to hear your thoughts on kind of, just as you've already kind of broken down a little bit what that is. It ties a little bit into a secondary question that I wanted to ask you, and I feel like maybe I will just ask it here, which is that some of the styles of asking for things in PGM spells can be more on the side of compelling than religiously asking, please, if I give you some incense, may I have it? And that relationship between compelling versus asking is sometimes, I think, a little hard for modern day practitioners if they come from more of a neo-pagan background. Can you talk a little bit about like how you view Heka and asking or compelling in PGM magic?
Sure.
It's a complex topic, I know.
And it is funny because I was just reading over a spell earlier today that seems to basically compel the great god, King of Kings, with threats of torture if you don't, send a friendly spirit with a prophecy. So I have not done that one, but I was discussing it because it seems to be like a precursor to medieval Galatia, where it's very, constraining demons and threatening them and things like that. But the PGM that comes from the Egyptian, so that's an Egyptian technique. It's definitely not Greek because the Greeks were like, ooh, hubris. So that's one of the things that I've definitely noticed about the PGM is the more I research it, the more Egyptian it is and the less Greek.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I work a lot with Greek deities, so I'm like, oh my. But as you pointed out, I mean, this is a period of Egyptian history that has a lot of Greek and Roman influence as well, although it's interesting. I'm not sure what your thoughts on this, but there's very few, like, it seems like there's less Roman influence than I would have imagined when I was first looking at this, given the time period. It's still, as you were saying, very Egyptian, very firmly Egyptian, even though it's in Greek a lot of times. Do you feel like there are things that are Roman that kind of come out or from other cultures, or is it mostly like, no, this is Egyptian practice? We're really looking at Egyptian with god names and things from other cultures.
Yeah, so I don't really feel like there's much Roman influence there, even though it was definitely the Roman era that this
Mm-hmm.
was, many of these texts were written in. But the Greeks moved into Egypt and were like, oh, here's Alexandria. It's going to be our big city now. And they made that like a capital of culture, whereas the Romans did not. The Romans, stayed in Rome and were like, okay, this is our granary. We're going to send some people here, but they didn't move their base of operations to Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and then hence that would be the reason why there's less of their influence, because they were just ruling from afar, shall we say? Yeah, and I think the other thing to note about PGM work is that it is eminently practical in many ways. There are spells for pretty much, well, not anything, but there are a wide variety of topics that you could be searching for a spell on and find something in the PGM that addresses it. And your website is, Practical Occult. So clearly practicality and that ability to apply things in our lives is very important. Do you feel like that's one of the reasons that it drew you to the PGM, or is that just sort of a byproduct of other things? Or how do you view that practicality with the PGM?
So it really is one of the things that drew me to the PGM. I heard good things from everyone that I know that was working with it. They said that, they tried this spell, they tried that spell, they got amazing results. And, I want to find out what gives amazing results. Now, one of the things that, people often ask me is, wow, some of these spells seem not doable. Like, take a falcon, murder
That was
the
my
falcon,
next question.
mummify the falcon and use this mummified falcon. It's like, whoa, yeah, let me just go down to Wegmans and get a falcon. But when it comes to those, I just say skip over them. Or, if you're adventurous, try to work around what you don't have. So at the time, it was a different period, a different culture, and things like sacrificing sacred animals, very, very common practice. So common that they would have Egyptian temples that were devoted to raising certain sacred animals for the purpose of sacrifice. So it really was like you could just run on down to your local temple and get a sacred falcon.
So, I mean, I think that's also, it's an interesting question that was literally my next question. You mentioned skipping over it. So that is, I think, one of the main things. For example, I mentioned to you before we started recording that my coven and I, I was teaching them, some things about Greek and Roman and Egyptian magic. That was kind of what the course was taking us to at that time. And when we were looking at the Bet's translation and things like that, that you do come across a number of spells that are just exceedingly complex and involve sacrificing animals or materials that are either just impossible to get anymore or extremely expensive. Is your rule always that you just skip over it, or have you done things where you have sort of treated it as like frog DNA that you can then put something else in its stead that would have a similar sort of correspondence according to our understanding of something, like something else that's sacred to Venus, or a cake that's in the shape of the animal that is supposed to be sacrificed? I've seen so many different options that people have done, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, I try to do what I can, and I also have a list of weird things I'm trying to acquire. So, for example, one thing that I was able to acquire was the modern version of gladiatorial dirt. I found some friends who knew someone who basically has a real life fight club, and I was like, "Hey, can you go get me some dirt?" So something like that. And then, for example, there's a spell that calls for gallows wood. And I wasn't able to procure that, but I was able to procure shipwreck wood. And I'm going to substitute that out and see if that works when it comes time to do the spell. But some of these spells are just so complex. They're kind of funny. And one of the things that I do wanted to mention is that as someone who's personally a practicing practitioner of magic, sometimes I will be getting information from a spirit about how to do something. I'll say, "Hey, how do I do this?" And I'll just write down whatever they say. So sometimes they say something that's incredibly off the wall and not possible for me to do, but I write it down anyway because I'm just writing down what they're saying. And then afterwards I'll say, okay, I'm going to need something easier, or I'm going to need something that emits, the sacrificial bowl or whatever, and then we'll go from there. But, sometimes I wonder if certain spells were never done. So for example, there's one to catch a thief, and it starts off by taking the skull of a man who drowned, and then you plant it in a field and you plant flax over top of it, and you do all this stuff. And then when the flax grows, you make it into a rope, and then you do knot magic. And I'm like, wow, that's a lot. And also in the PGM itself, there's way easier spells to catch a thief. So why would you even try to do that if there's another spell that's much easier?
Yeah. That is very interesting. And oftentimes the answer is another spell is the answer. Another option. And it's interesting to think of those examples that may never have been done, like the flax field. And yet the symbolism of that is interesting. So maybe there was some reason that someone wrote that down as a story, but not as an actual spell that was performed. But
well, like I said, it could have been spirit instructions where the spirit said, "Hey, if you do this, this will work." And they were like,
and you're noting it. And speaking of that, it kind of jumps a little bit in what I wanted to ask you about, but what you just said there about when you ask for clarity or for extra information about how to perform a spell and you receive instructions, how do you think about, or how do you practice that in terms of spirit contact for that? Is this something where you're doing a form of journey work, a form of, sort of like just going into trance and working that way? Is this more like you're thinking of it with, like, is there scrying involved with that? I'm just curious kind of like what you can tell us about your method of contact there.
Sure. I definitely do journeying. I have training in that, and that was one of my primary practices for many years. Sometimes I just kind of know what they're saying, right? Like I don't necessarily always hear them, but I'm like, okay, I should do this. Like I'll say, wow, I should really go get an offering for the sun god. And, it'll be like white flowers. I'll be like,
Yeah.
okay. But, when I can, I work with a scryer who's very
Mhm.
psychic, and, we can do that together.
I
There's
see.
also, I haven't used them because I don't need to, but there's methods of inducting a scryer in the PGM, which some of them even specifically say they work for adults, because it was also a practice at the time to have a child do your scrying.
Mhm. I was going to ask, yes, if this was, I mean, just because it's interesting because of course there are times when I think probably every one of us has sort of been around kids that are, I mean, it sounds like you were one of those magical children. I was as well, where you're just like, oh, we have this contact. And there's not to say that you, sometimes when you're reading those accounts, you're like, well, this sounds like they're just using these children in ways that I'm maybe not comfortable with. But there are times when there are like ways that children have connections to the other world that could be very easy to ask questions with in a way that is, very appropriate for the spirits and for the child. But it is, of course, something that adults can be trained in, and it's usually the much more practical approach at this time. Do you usually use the same scryer? Is this someone that you work with regularly, or do
Yeah,
you work sometimes with different people?
I always work with the same scryer,
Ah, very, very cool.
but
Um,
he's less into being a semi-public figure than I am.
oh, sure. Yeah, no, it's understandable. Is this something, when you're talking about scrying, do you think of your scrying practice as mostly involving PGM work, or is that something that you also do in relation to your Solomonic or other grimoire work?
Oh, I also do it in relation to other grimoire work, and
Mhm.
in those cases, even sometimes doing the trithemius operation, drawing spirits into crystals, where I then see the spirit appear in the crystal.
Mhm.
So that's kind of cool.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that there are a number of bowl divinations within the PGM, which I've found fascinating. I haven't done PGM ones, I've done rites that are from other places besides the PGM. But I was wondering, is there anything that you could share from your experience of working with PGM divination tech that you might share as like an example of something that you've done that would be an interesting thing to share, if possible? No, that's fine too.
Well, I wish I might have to put this on my site. That divination about the send me a dream. It's so short.
Mhm.
So basically, it says speak this to the day lamp, which I've interpreted as any candle or candle holder that I've had in a ritual ever.
Mhm.
So I just light that candle or lamp. And actually, the ancient oil lamps are not very much of a fire hazard. Like they're very flat and low to the ground, and people use them for hundreds of years as a main source of light indoors. uh, so I picked up a couple from historical recreation or historical uh, replica sites,
Mhm.
very very cheap. Fill them with oil and a little wick. Um, so then you say the spell, very very short, to the day lamp, and ask that you be given um, a dream of fire and iron if no, or water and plants if yes,
Mhm.
and then just sleep.
Yeah.
But dream induction and getting answers in dreams was very common.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite forms of divination, though I don't do the PGM rites. That's something I think I've just always done since I was a kid. And it is beautiful how simple it can be. And I think that's something I've noticed sometimes when I've talked to people about these methodologies where it's almost as if it's in our human nature to want more complex answers. We want to make it complicated because then that will, I don't want to say feel more magical, but in a sense, it's almost as if we feel like we need to have more stuff or more complications to make it really work. But I'm assuming that you would probably err on the side of sometimes no.
So it's funny that you say that because there's one there's some magic that I do professionally, which involves consecrating an object to be magical, and I use the PGM for that. And there's this big long spell that I always use for this particular product. And one time I was there and I was doing this whole big long thing, and the spirit was like, you don't have to do this whole thing. You just have to call me because I'm the one that makes it magical, and I'm here. Like, so here I am. Like, it's kind of awkward. Like at a fancy party where you're announcing someone and you're like, here's all their titles, and they're like looking at their watch, and they're like, okay, get on with it. And I was like, it probably is easier to not do this whole thing, but I'm just going to stick with what I already do.
You can stick with what you know in some ways and know that it's going to work, even if sometimes. No, that's very true. And I think that it's I think it's a fine line between sometimes knowing that there are times when you can simplify things, or you have that where a spirit is literally telling you, hey, I'm here, have other stuff to do, so maybe we could get started, without saying, oh, I see what she's saying is nothing matters, and I can do whatever I want and call a spirit however I want, and this is going to work. And I'm not suggesting that's what you're saying, but I think that comes with experience. I would assume that where you kind of start to see where the line is of what you need and what you don't need, but you have to take it seriously either way.
Right. And I think that line might be different with every spirit. So this comes down to different spirit relationships. Yeah. So if it's a spirit that I'm calling on for the first time, I really do want all of the bells and whistles, and I want all of the announcements and their titles, and fanfare and their favorite incense and whatnot. But if it's a spirit that I've worked with every week for 4 years, I can just be like, hey, let's do the thing. And they might just show up.
Because that relationship is there. Yeah.
Right. Especially if there's timing involved. So, with my grimoire magic, there is some astrological timing having to do with both the phases of the moon, and the timing of the day and the day of the week and things like that. So it's almost like having a regularly scheduled appointment, like, every Friday I've got this Zoom meeting and we do this. So it's kind of setting an expectation for the spirit also, like, it's Tuesday in the hour of Mars, here's Martian spirits ready to be summoned.
Yeah. And as you do that more, then kind of that instinct also kicks in of kind of knowing the timing already, because you and the spirit both have the timing starting to become more instinctive. Well, spirits don't need to become more instinctive, but you know what I mean with us.
Another thing that I think is really useful in practical magic is having an emissary spirit. And I think this is kind of underrated, but I've got spirits that I work with very closely that it's easy for me to communicate with them. And it's easy for them to communicate with other spirits, including spirits I haven't met yet. So I can say, like a diplomat, hey, contact so-and-so's secretary and let them know that I will be calling upon them next week.
Interesting. Yes.
So
Is there, in terms of those spirits, are those spirits that you worked with originally through grimoire magic? Are those more PGM spirits? Are they spirits that are not from either of those sources? I'm just kind of curious.
yeah, so I had an emissary spirit for my initial journey work, but then I picked up the spirits of the fourth pentacle of Mercury. That are known for being emissaries, and I've just been leaning on them for years now because they're delightful, and they're also great at answering questions of all sorts. So between finding information, directing me to information, and performing diplomatic and emissary duties with other spirits, I just really love them and work with them a lot.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I think that's very true, because that idea of having not gatekeepers kind of makes it sound a little bit negative, and it's more of this is a person who knows more spirits than I do, a spirit that can then help with the introductions, as you're saying, and get you in touch with the right spirits.
Right. So that is sometimes called like a supernatural assistant, which is such a great term because it really kind of encompasses what their job is.
Mm-hmm. No, that is very fascinating. When you are, if someone was embarking upon looking towards finding a connection to some form of an emissary spirit, would you put them in the direction of those same mercurial spirits? Are there others that you found or heard work well? Because sometimes people are like, oh, well, what if I don't have a connection to them? Should I just, I don't know, go and ask, hello, can you help me? But do you have any recommendations for finding that for people who might be closer to beginning?
So that's a good question. The Secrets of Helios, which is the Hadean guide that I just wrote, does have. It can be used once you've connected to the sun god. You can ask for a familiar. So specifically, all over the Greek Magical Papyri, the sun god is being petitioned to send, spirits of prophecy or spirits of divination. So that's something that happens all the time, and some folks might be surprised that it's the sun being petitioned in those cases as opposed to the moon. But in Egyptian theology, when the sun goes into the underworld every day, and when it passes through the different sections of the underworld, it shines on the dead and they wake up. So
so the sun in that sense is kind of more of a chthonic spirit than we would otherwise assume, where it's like
exactly. And when I first saw this calling on the sun god, and for basically ghost work, I was very surprised until I read more about Egyptian theology and could maybe see where that was coming from.
Yeah, no, that is very fascinating, and you're right. That's not something that is for people who. I mean, our modern culture is kind of Greek mythology biased in that sense. Like at least for a lot of people, maybe it's just me, but I think a little less so on the Egyptian mythology. So that is important to keep in mind that as we were originally saying, this is very Egyptian magic, and therefore those worldviews and those creation myths are more at play.
There is also plenty of magic calling on Hecate or Selene for that as well in the PGM. So it's a mixed bag. Like I said, it crosses like 400 years of different papyri written by different people, doing different things.
One of the things that's fascinating with PGM is of course the fact that we can look at these documents, and we can look at them in the digitized photographs. You know what I mean? The accounts of them that are online through our modern age, that we can actually look at these papyri. However, there are, when you look at that, a lot of holes, literal holes. I was explaining to a friend of mine, I was like, yeah, there's sometimes there's holes in it. And she's like, oh, so how do they fill that in? I'm like, well, no, but it's a literal hole. There's a piece missing. And then people have to do their best filling in with what they can. Are there times when you fill things in with other forms of ancient magic, like what we know about ancient Christian magic or ancient, Jewish magic or Greek practices or other sort of forms of magic, or even like kind of plugging in Solomonic practices? Do you think about that in terms of where you're sourcing things to put in those missing pieces?
So it depends on the spell. In some cases, so for example, the spell that I wrote about in the Secrets of Helios, that's pretty complete. But there's another spell that also references calling on the sun and saying that the sun has different forms and different hours. And that one is full of holes. So that's why I didn't write about the second one, because it's just got so many missing sections. But we can draw on the one that's more complete and then make inferences about the second spell based on the the similarities and the context, which we can trace through PGM era astrologers and priests of the time who wrote.
Yeah. Yes, and with that being said, I think that I remember hearing, I think you were interviewed on Glitch Bottle, and there's a great story about when you were, there was a spell that you amended and used while on a riding lawnmower. And your example was, I think excellent for people to understand that while this is magic, as you were saying, when you're first introducing yourself to these spirits, you're going to use the correct incense, you're going to use the correct timing to the best of your ability. And you're taking this seriously and doing this in a ritual container, space. There are also other times when it can be applied in ways that are not in your spirit room with clouds of frankincense. Is there another example of something that had immensely practical effects that you might be able to share with us? Because I think that's a really lovely thing for people to hear. And it could have the clouds of incense too. I don't really mind, but
so yeah, that's that spell that I was using is there's an opening formula from the stele of Jew, or sometimes IEOU is actually how it is in the text. And it starts off and it's subject to me all diamonds, and so basically it's constraining all diamonds everywhere, diamond being a spirit. So I the first time I used this for some I guess like off book reason, I was engraving, and I had recently purchased a somewhat expensive hand drill engraver. And I was attempting to engrave lodestone for a PGM spell, but the magnetic dust from the lodestone jammed this thing up so badly, I couldn't even take it apart to clean it out. And I was like, oh, am I going to have to like ship this somewhere to someone for repair? Like this is not working. And I was really, really frustrated because I couldn't work anymore, because it was my tool that I used to work with. So I used the section of the spell to command the spirit of my hand drill to work. I commanded it to unjam, and it did. So that was the first animistic off-brand use of that spell. But I've since used it to do things like start my car when the battery was dead. And there's a huge thread in the PGM study and practice group about people fixing their air conditioning or their printer or things like that. And it's funny because some of my peers have really made this into something for ridicule, that I would be using this magic for things that are beneath their, because they see it as being like religious magic, and this is beneath you to be using it for this, and I'm like, it works, and I'm here for it to work, and also as far as religious studies go, I feel like I feel like if you can give people something that works, they're gonna, maybe some of them want to look behind the curtain and say, wow, this is real, and I want to connect with these spirits that are making this happen.
Hmm.
So I think that that's going to be a real way for people to pursue that, is like the what's in it for me first, then leading them to more spirituality.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And there's also a certain uh, yeah, I dislike that, reaction, because it's how many people have not first come to magic because, you need something. You really need it, and you need something
Yeah.
that's going to help you out of a really desperate situation, which is a very real human thing, which is a real reason for magic existing in the first place. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because that's the nature of humans and our relationships with spirits, is sometimes we need to work together for real reasons.
Exactly. So when you look at the PGM, there's these spells for things like curing a scorpion sting.
Mm.
Like if you lived in Egypt at the time, getting stung by a scorpion is a very real fear. Not so much in Delaware, but definitely in Egypt. And what are you going to do about that? It's not like you can just run down to the doctor.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, yes, I clearly fall on your end of the spectrum of that. So the number of times I have used, well, it may not be PGM spells because I don't have the fluency with it that you do, but certainly other spell techniques to get a parking spot when I really need it. Being in New York a lot, man, oh, sometimes that's a really tricky thing, but it works when you need it sometimes, because sometimes it's a real desire and deep-seated need that magic comes to heal, even if it's the small things. That's our lives. So
Also, where I'm in the United States, like you are, and in today's world, like everything just about needs magic. Like finding an affordable place to live basically
Mhm.
requires magic.
Yes, no, it's very, very true. I think that then that kind of leads a little bit into my next question, which was how what how do you interact with the idea of ritual purity? It's not something that, particularly in my practice, I mean, although there are practices that I do that definitely require certain, like, fasting regimes and things like that in order to reach certain states, or as offerings to various spirits. What is your relationship, or how do you view necessities of purification or rites around protection for PGM work? I know some people get a little not scared, but a little concerned about, like, who these spirits are that they're working with in the PGM. Do you feel like there is more of a need for protection or phylacteries or things of that nature when working with these spirits, or how do you view that?
Well, I started creating phylacteries pretty early on.
Mhm.
So phylacteries are protective items that are worn, as opposed to later grimoires where you've got this big protective setup on the floor that you've probably drawn and things like that. I get the opinion that that wasn't so much of a thing back in the PGM era.
Mhm.
People were maybe making house calls or going around to do things.
Mhm.
I'm not really sure, but yeah, so I definitely lean on having phylacteries. And as far as ritual purity goes, there's a lot of different ways to approach that. And one of the things that I really like when trying to contextualize the Greek Magical Papyri is looking at the writings of Plutarch. So Plutarch on purity, he talks about how, and this is in Isis and Osiris, which was one of his letters that he wrote. He gives a recounting of the different types of purity that different Egyptian priests have in different cities. So he says in one city, the priests abstain from all fish, but in this city, they only abstain from this sort of fish. And so he lists all these different um, ways that people do things, but also that they all have meaning. And he cautions people against superstition, which is just doing things because, you know, you were just told to. Like,
Yeah. Because
There's so even within the magic of the period, the meanings for purity were different. And I've as far as purity for Egyptian priesthood, I've never shaved all my hair off for that. That's the thing that the Egyptian priests used to do. But also, I don't live in an environment that's full of desert lice. So, that's not
that's a
really a
factor.
problem.
Mhm. Yeah.
So like when you think about, you know, what was considered pure back then versus what is considered pure today, there's definitely things that offend spirits, and you want to find out what those are and not do them. So some spirits are offended by the smell of sex. So you don't want to go in smelling like sex.
Mhm.
Or having recently had it.
Mhm.
Um, and some of those, they might have just been more of a cultural thing, like the shaving your hair off, based on the environment, the prevalence of lice, and everything that was going on at the time.
Mhm. Yeah, which means that then you need to understand more of or do at least due diligence to try to understand the context of the time and why those things would have been the case, so that you can be respectful of it, even if that may not be our context anymore, something else may be appropriate. And then I'm assuming part of that comes down to also you can, using divination or journey work and that kind of being open to information, listen if you are given instruction about something, although you don't just do it just because the spirit says, because sometimes they may ask for something and you're like, no, actually, how about, we need to come to a different understanding.
Yeah. So one of the things I also want to say for folks that might be worried about getting into this is that, with all of the spirits that I work with, I have found that trying your best goes very, very far, right?
Mhm.
So they know that a huge amount of time has elapsed since people were doing this regularly, and they're happy to be working with us again. So if we don't know all of the things that a priest would have done at the time, that's not a deal breaker.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, an interesting thing I've been thinking about in relationship to practice and kind of coming to skill and understanding with these things. Is it's really fun to talk about the times when things worked really, really well, but I think it's also sometimes good to hear about times when something didn't work, or how you modified a practice when you found something didn't work, and then you had to either find a workaround or find a different way of doing it that did work. Is there an example that you could give us of something that you were like, yeah, this is going to work, fantastic, I got it, and then you had to actually change it because something was off?
Absolutely. So and this is also touched on in the Secrets of Helios. So I used the consecration spell that I wrote about in the Secrets of Helios, and I made this really, really cool little shadow box. So I have a friend who's a biologist and insect collector, and for my birthday a few years ago, he had gifted me a dead preserved scarab beetle. So I was like, ooh, I'm gonna try my hand at insect pinning, and I'm gonna make this into like a little solar object. And I got fancy paint. So I got real cinnabar and real crushed lapis, and from this company that does antique pigments, so you can paint like people back in the day did. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna make this, you know, iconography of the sun as a scarab, and then I'm going to consecrate it with this spell, and I'm going to invite a solar spirit to come live in it and be my familiar. So I did this, and I was like, yeah, this is going to be great. And this familiar spirit shows up, but it doesn't want to go into the shadow box. And I'm like, look, here's a bug. It's like your solar iconography, and it's like, ugh. And then I realized, like, oh, that's a dead bug full of chemicals, and it smells like a dead chemical smelly bug. And then I thought about how mummification in Egypt was done with all of these fragrant resins and things like that. And I was like, maybe the smell actually was an important factor. And that it's because, that's a thing that comes up a lot in spirit interactions and grimoires, which is, you want this fragrant incense, and, you do want to smell like this, and you don't want to smell like this. And so I'm in the middle of this ritual, and I'm like, oh, okay. So then I like left the ritual, and I happened to have this tiny little bone chip of human bone that I'd gotten as a present. So I took it and I put it in the shadow box, and I was like, here's a bone instead. And it was like, I have a body again. It was delighted. The bone was perfect. The smelly bug, not so much.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, because it is, we go with the best information we have, and sometimes we don't think like a spirit because we're not we're not from their perspective. But being able to figure that out, yeah.
And I spent so much time on the shadow box.
Oh, I'm sure that did hurt. All those ingredients, yeah.
Yeah. But live and learn.
Yeah. Oh, that's really fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, because I think that's good. And it's another reminder of smells are very important for a lot of spirits, so take that seriously. Is there anything else that you would want to share with someone who was looking to, let's say they just got their shiny new, like their Bet's translation, and they got your book, Secrets of Helios. Is there anything else that you would want to share with them to make their entry into doing this work easier? Something that you kind of wish someone would have told you when you were getting started with it, outside of pay attention to smells?
Well, I'm trying to write guides for me from years ago, right? Like I wish I'd had this guide, therefore I'm now capable of writing it. I'm going to write it for just me. So the people coming up can just take a look at that. But I'm really excited about a project by Brian Alt called Interlinear Magic, which is going to be a new translation of many of the spells of the PGM. So that's definitely there was a fully funded Kickstarter, and I believe that book is coming out this year. But there'll definitely be more information in the PGM study and practice group about his work. And he's got a PhD, and teaches Greek language. So he's really qualified to be digging into this, and I'm pretty excited.
That is wonderful. Yeah, that is great. And more people we have doing this and then sharing their results, and like you are, and like so many other people are, it's just wonderful for all of us to then be able to benefit from that experience and talk with one another about it.
It is. And I do want to say one thing about translations and the Bet's version.
Oh, please. Yes.
So I don't think that there's anything wrong with the Bet's version, but this stuff is all originally in Greek, and it really does help when you can look at the Greek and try to figure out some of the words from that. So certain words have maybe more of a connotation in their Greek form than they do now. So that's one of the reasons why I partnered with Corey C. Childs to get a new translation of the spell, so that we could redo that, and then also look at those words and talk about them.
Yeah, and I think you're right that there's a anytime you only have one translation of something, you're going to lose something, because there's just levels of subtlety of meaning that we're not going to get of a one-to-one correlation, unless you A, learn the original and know your Greek, or B, at least be able to compare and contrast a few different translations and find what's underneath somehow. But that's tough to do when people are only accessing one translation, unless they speak multiple languages, in which case that's easier. But
right.
Yeah.
I just one of the things that I wish I'd maybe focused on earlier in my PGM career was the Greek, because sometimes I get hung up on certain words, certain English words. And then I would talk to, a Greek friend of mine, and they'd be like, oh, that just means this, or that's just like a common phrase they would have said or whatever. Whereas I'm like, ooh, this is important. And they're like, it's really not.
Yeah, that is very, very true. And language matters, and it's not the same in every language. So hence the difficulties.
Yeah. So if folks go to my website, Practical Occult, there's a full translation, the English translation of the spell that I keep talking about. And then there's also a pronunciation guide, which has the Greek. So there's an audio file of Corey reciting all of this in Greek, and there's also certain words that you're going to find in the PGM which remain untranslated. So barbarous words, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but just for your audience, you'll be reading the spell and then it'll just devolve into stuff, with a lot of letters. And you're like, wow, okay. But those tend to be Egyptian phrases for the gods, usually. And they're rendered phonetically into Greek, and because of the translator segregation, because back in the day when people were first tackling the text of the PGM, everything was very sectionalized. So it was like, okay, I'm a Greek translator, I am an Egyptian translator, so you've got these Greek translators that are very familiar with Greek, but less familiar with the Egyptian. So when they saw transliterated Egyptian phrases, they did not recognize them.
Very interesting. Yeah. So
I guess transliterated words on my site for people to help pronounce.
Yeah, that's excellent. I guess I've seen, various, so these barbarous names or nomina magica, like they're called a number of different things. So when people are like looking at the stuff, they may find it referred to a number of different ways, which also is confusing. Yay. But it's also that sometimes people will try to have meanings for absolutely every word, and it's okay. What I was told is it's okay not to have necessarily what they mean. They still have the power in them as well. But it is fascinating to think of them also as like transliterations that have sort of been lost because of that bias of the translators, or the fact that they were, subject to different translators at different times.
Right. And some of it, like I mentioned, some of it is Egyptian, but some of it's also degraded Hebrew. So it's funny because it reminds me of a video I saw one time of, it was like one of those Got Talent shows where singers come on and they're, good amateurs and trying to show off their stuff. And it was some Asian country, and they had a lady come on, and I can't remember which song it was, but it was a very popular classic English song, only she did not know English at all. And she was just kind of like phonetically singing it. And she messed up like all of the words, but you still knew what the song was. So I, as an English speaking person, like was very familiar with the song that she was singing, which I forget at the time right now. But none of those words were actually English.
Yeah.
It was just kind of garbled. So that's kind of how I feel about the gods, hearing us. They're like,
oh, look at that. They're trying to say that. That's cute. But we know what they mean. Sure. Yes. Yeah. As opposed to getting too hung up on, obviously you want to try your best, but we will probably end up sounding like a Got Talent person who, yeah. Oh, that is really lovely, and I think it is that part. It goes back to that, the spirits are inclined to help because we are attempting to contact them after maybe not in spirit time, but a rather long time of this not being practiced, and therefore there is that flexibility, within reason, flexibility that we go to it with the best that we can, which I love about your work, and I love what you are presenting to the world in terms of what you are helping people find through this. So as we wrap up, we have mentioned your recent release through Hadean Press a couple of times. I will have that in the show notes, and your website's going to be in the show notes and other things. Is there anything else that you'd want to tell people about? I want to have you back on to talk about your, other works that you do magically, but is there anything else you want to share with us before we stop?
No, I think that covers it. And my website also has all of the resources for the Secrets of Helios and links to go buy it from Hadean. So
beautiful.
Try to make it really easy for folks.
That is really lovely. I will have all that in the show notes. Sorry.
I was going to say, I really do hope more pagans and more covens use this work. I think it would be really nice.
Mm-hmm. I think it's fantastic, and I will just say, it's the root of everything that we're doing now. So we gotta. It's part of knowing our history and then learning the roots. Gotta go back to the sources, man.
Yeah. In the meantime, also, let magic help you win. These are practical spells for helping to get ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a beautiful thing to start the year on, since it's January right now, and also to end the interview on. So thank you, Alison. I really appreciate this, and I'm sure I hope we will talk again on the show. So thank you.
I would like that. Thank you so much.
A very fascinating conversation about the PGM, a form of Egyptian magic which I find fascinating and have been doing a little bit more with lately. I also appreciated very much her reflections on practical magic and the need to make sure that our practices are very firmly grounded in our lives. It's wonderful to study these things, and they certainly reward study and reflection, but then sometimes we really do need to dive in and get our hands dirty and ask for help from the spirits and see what comes to us. If you've enjoyed this episode, I really hope that you will take the time to subscribe, to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you happen to hear our episodes. And you can check out our website at www.coffeeanddivination.com. I'm always happy to hear from people, and if you have suggestions for guests or topics that you'd like to hear, please send us a little message. We're also on Instagram at Coffee and Divination. For now, I hope that you enjoy your journeys with divination, and I'll see you next time.
Can we say we believe?